Dr. Gibbs, welcome and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you and glad we could finally get you doing a program with us.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon to those in the western half of the country. Good evening to those in the eastern half. And I must say that now, still in the midst of the greatest public health crisis in 100 years, I can't think of a time that would be better to delve into medical history and learn from lessons of the past.
Well, thank you again for joining us. Let's start out with a general question. And just to lay a foundation for everyone that doesn't have a keen background on medicine in the American Revolution, or let alone the 18th century, what was it like to be a doctor in the North American colonies in 1776? And what kind of training did they have?
Well, if you were a doctor in 1775, 1776, you would have been about one of 3,500 practitioners. But the odds would be that you never set foot in a school of medicine. That's because most practitioners learn by the apprenticeship technique. That meant it was informal, unregulated, and you would learn at the bedside from another practitioner. About 10% of the practitioners in the colonies at the time went to medical school, either in Europe or in the United States. In the United States, there were really only two medical schools at the time of the Revolution. The first one was started in 1765. It was in Philadelphia, in my medical alma mater. It became the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. And the other was opened in New York City and eventually became the Columbia University School of Medicine. But that closed, it was forced to be closed during the British occupation. So if you were a physician, there was a 100% chance that you'd be a male. The first female did not graduate from an American medical school until the 1840s. That was Elizabeth Blackwell. And your way of practicing medicine back then was really little change since the ancients. It featured bleedings and purges and leeches and vomits. There were a few drugs that were of value. There were some drugs to control pain and some for fever. But overall, it was not at all a practice that was similar to what we know as modern medicine. That didn't get started for another 75 to 100 years.
Gotcha. So it's safe to assume that disease played a major role in everyday life back then as it does today.
Well, in fact, it did. You know, today we still often begin letters by saying, I hope you are well. Well, back in the times of the American Revolution, that was really a pretty important question. I hope you're well. How are you doing? So because of the ravages of infections and other diseases, the average male's lifespan would be in the late 40s or early 50s. And for women, it was often less because of death from childbirth. Among infants, the mortality might be as high as 25% in the first year of life. And in Jean Abrams' book about the revolutionary medicine, she says that disease and death was just part of the American psyche during the revolutionary period, always present and always to be concerned about.
Wow. And I can imagine that conditions of war during the American Revolution must have made things much worse than that.
Well, things really came together during war. So we have to give a little bit of background as to what life was like in the colonies before the war. The population of the colonies was just about 3 million. The largest city was Philadelphia with 30,000. New York was about 20,000, and Boston and Charleston, they were 10,000. So nearly everybody was living on farms or small villages, and hardly anybody moved more than 30 miles from where they were born during their entire lifetimes. So the war changed all that. It brought together great masses of humanity, 20 or 30,000 at a time. And they moved great distances. And they lived in crowded conditions. And the diet was poor. And in wintertime, the soldiers often lived in very drafty, poorly insulated huts. And then they were exposed to often epidemic disease. And this all made for a giant circumstance where things would be made worse by wartime.
So let's continue to focus on the war itself now. Everybody has seen paintings of battles of the American Revolution with the cannons, the muskets, bayonets, and swords. And people often associate the leading cause of death in modern warfare as being caused by wounds received on the battlefield. But that wasn't exactly the case in the American Revolution, was it?
Well, exactly. It was, in fact, just the reverse. So maybe of the total deaths, 7 out of every 8 or so were caused by disease. And the battlefield casualties may be accounted for about 1/8. Best estimates were there were maybe on the American side 7,000 men killed in action. So most of the deaths were due to disease. Well, why was that? Well, part of it was the state of the art of medicine. And secondly was the technology of warfare then. There were only a few major battles each year. The weapons were slow firing and had relatively short range. So yes, there would be wounds that would include gunshot wounds and stabbing wounds like from bayonets or swords, and some would be horrendous wounds from cannonballs. But by and large, what did end most of the soldiers would be disease and largely infections.
Wow. So building from that, since disease was a soldier's worst nightmare, so to speak, what were some of the common diseases that were the greatest threats to those fighting in both the British and the American armies?
Well, the big one was smallpox, which occurred in epidemic proportions. But day in and day out, there were others that took a greater toll. So one of them we call today typhus. Back then, it went by the name of jail fever or ship fever or hospital fever or camp fever, all indicating that this was a disease that was occurring in crowded conditions. It was spread by lice, and it had a high mortality. Fever, skin conditions, headache, sore tongue. Today, typhus is rarely seen, but it can be diagnosed and can be readily treated by a common antibiotic of the tetracycline family. Now, we also know that although today malaria is largely a tropical disease, back during the 18th century, malaria during the war months would even get up into the middle colonies, like Pennsylvania or New York. Malaria was called intermittent or remittent fever because of its very characteristic pattern of fever. And this had a very high mortality as well. There were drugs that could be used. There was a preparation called Jesuit's bark or Peruvian bark. This came from South America and contained a quinine preparation that could be used. Well, we still see malaria today. During the Vietnam War, many soldiers had malaria if they didn't take their prophylaxis. And today we see malaria largely in travelers who don't take the appropriate preventative medication. Malaria is one of the most dramatic presentations in medicine with rigors and shaking chills and fever. And medications we have today take care of almost all varieties of malaria. And one of them, called hydroxychloroquine, got a lot of press last year when it was purported to be a potential treatment for COVID-19. So in addition to malaria and typhus, venereal diseases played a big role in the armies then, as in all armies. But in the 18th century, syphilis could not be distinguished from gonorrhea, but these were common disorders. And dysentery was very common, owing to the poor circumstances of hygiene in many armies. Well, it could have been viral, it could have been bacterial, although the doctors had no way of knowing at that time because they didn't understand the microbiology. But typhoid fever, that could be fatal as well. And one of the fortunate things about the time of the American Revolution is that yellow fever did not occur. But as many know, there was a huge outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia in the 1790s, and that was a very devastating disease. So lots of things would go on. In wintertime, there'd be pneumonia, there'd be influenza, there'd be a variety of skin conditions owing to poor hygiene and lack of bathing. The stage was set for a lot of things to inflict upon the soldiers and others affiliated with the Army.
Yeah, that all sounds pretty miserable to me. So since doctors had no knowledge about viruses and bacteria, what could they do to try and prevent or control these infections? Were there recommendations to deal with unsanitary practices?
Right. So knowledge of modern microbiology, that got started again in the late 19th century. So 75 to 100 years after the American Revolution, particularly by famous investigators like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. But the physicians during the American Revolution had no foundation in modern microbiology, but they were good observers. And they made observations about the importance of hygiene and cleanliness. One of the prominent British physicians was named Sir John Pringle, and he wrote much about hygiene. He gave directions about the importance of latrines and where they should be dug and how deep and how far from the encampment. In the American Army, in fact, if a soldier eased himself other than in the latrine, he paid a penalty, and the penalty was up to 5 lashes because of the importance of that. Other physicians also observed the importance of cleanliness and hygiene. And Benjamin Rush, Dr. Benjamin Rush in 1777, got a pamphlet together called Directions on Preserving the Health of Soldiers. So these were the beginnings of public health, and they were able to have an important impact even without knowledge of microbiology.
Okay, so let's take a step back and talk about Dr. Benjamin Rush a little bit, because he was present at the Battle of Brandywine, and he was a pretty important figure.
Right. So let's bring up the image. So this is an image of Dr. Benjamin Rush later in his life. And he was one of the truly remarkable characters of the entire Revolutionary period. He was born around Philadelphia and then went to the prestigious medical school at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He graduated at the ripe young age of just 23, and then spent the next year or so in London and Paris, where he rubbed elbows with everybody. He met famous physicians like William Hunter and John Pringle, who we mentioned. Then he would meet men of letters, Dr. Samuel Johnson and Oliver Goldsmith, and the painters Benjamin West and Sir Joshua Reynolds. So he really had a way of getting his way into meeting others. He is described by Stephen Fried as having an outsized ego, so he was very self-confident, and you might even say he was cocky, but very strong and self-confident in himself. So after his years in Europe, he returned to Philadelphia, took a post as the first chair of the Department of Chemistry at what became the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, and he was still a very young man at the time. And then he begins to get himself involved in the Patriot movement. And here in America, just as in Europe, he met everybody. He knew Benjamin Franklin, and he had lunch with Thomas Jefferson, and he knew George Washington, and he worked with Thomas Paine on the pamphlet Common Sense. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, he was the fourth youngest member of the Continental Congress at the time. In his medical world, he was the champion of health. In addition to preserving health, he advocated for the humane treatment of mental illness and has earned the title of the father of American psychiatry. On the social front, he was a strong abolitionist against slavery, and he advocated for the education of women. He was a physician in the military. In 1777, he became the director of the medical department of the Middle Department, and he was at Trenton, he was at Princeton, and yes, he came to the battlefield at Brandywine and took care of many of the casualties, many of whom had been left on the battlefield overnight. So a truly remarkable, multifaceted person was Benjamin Rush.
Absolutely. He does sound like a truly remarkable guy. And I know that General Howe, in the following days after the battle, because he couldn't care for, let alone his men, because he was overwhelmed, let alone Washington's men, he did send a dispatch to Washington, and Washington sent Benjamin Rush to the Birmingham Meeting House in the days following. So Benjamin Rush was a prominent figure even after the Battle of Brandywine itself. So truly remarkable man from what you just described. So let's take a step back here again and go back to the diseases. One of the most common diseases throughout the war, as you mentioned, was smallpox. And oftentimes when we discuss the American Revolution, the word inoculation is quite common as a means of preventing it. Can you discuss inoculation a little bit? Did the armies require inoculation? Was it safe and effective? And what replaced inoculation later down the road?
Right. So inoculation had been used in Asia for centuries. And then it made its way into England in the beginning of the 18th century. So to describe inoculation, this basically meant you gave a weakened course, a mild course of smallpox to the inoculee. And the way that it was generally done was to make a small incision or a scratch in the skin, and then take some of the pustular fluid from someone who had smallpox, and either with a thread or a spatula, put it right into the scratch. Well, this caused a smallpox case, but generally one that had mild symptoms. Everyone who got inoculation had symptoms of one degree or another, and it did have a mortality of about 1%, but this was much better than the mortality of the natural disease, which was way up at about 25 or 30%. Well, the British Army began to require inoculation about 1750, but for the British Army in North America, there was not such good adherence, and many of the soldiers skipped out on it. Inoculation in North America was less widely used than it was in England. And so there was a more vulnerable population to smallpox. The American Army, being more vulnerable, did have an order in 1777 to require inoculation, but that actually was not complied with a bit. So maybe what we could do is go to the clip, and then I'll tell you the wonderful story about Dr. Edward Jenner.
Absolutely.
So this clip, Andrew, do you want to say where you found that one?
Sure. This is from the HBO miniseries John Adams. There is a scene where Abigail and the children are being inoculated. So I will press play, and Dr. Gibbs, you can give us a little description on what's going on. Just make sure the volume's up.
Here the doctor is paying a visit to the Adams household.
Right inside.
And he now goes to the cart where there is a victim, a still barely live victim with smallpox. So take a look at all of these smallpox pustules. And with a probe and a lancet, he removes some of the pustular fluid, puts it on a plate, and now we'll carry out the inoculation. You may recognize the actress. This is Laura Linney, who is playing Abigail Adams. And he, with a lancet, he makes a scratch or an incision in her arm, and then inoculates her with the pustular fluid. And she's very brave about this. And then take a look at the children's facial expressions, because they know that they're next. So that was inoculation. Well, because it had a mortality of about 1%, everybody got sick, it wasn't ideal. And what came along in the 1790s was the observation of Dr. Edward Jenner, a country doctor in England. He made the observation that milkmaids would often get a condition called cowpox on their hands. And this was a mild infection, and the milkmaids would be immune to having smallpox. So Edward Jenner carried out an experiment. There was no human research committee at the time, and there was no consent at the time. But what he did was to inoculate the 8-year-old son of his gardener intentionally with cowpox. And then he tried to inoculate the young boy with smallpox, but the young boy was immune. So this was Edward Jenner's hallmark contribution in the history of mankind, in the history of medicine, and it was the beginning of our whole story of vaccination. And the story could not have a better current story than right now, where we have seen one of the great tributes to scientific advances and the rapid development of highly effective vaccines against COVID-19.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seemed to be effective back then, and very effective, leading up to modern times. Now, from a 21st century view, other medical practices of 250 years ago, such as bleedings, as you mentioned before, leeches, purges, etc., sound somewhat counterintuitive. Can you tell us more about why doctors use these methods, and when did things start to change?
Well, right. So practice really hadn't changed very much in the 18th century since ancient times. And the reason was the prevailing theory of of disease. So it was called the humoral theory. Nothing funny, humorous about it, but humors were bodily fluids. And it was believed that disease was caused when the bodily fluids would get out of balance. So there was an internal logic. And if you thought an imbalance in the bodily fluids caused the disease, then it made sense to say, well, we're going to restore the balance by taking blood off, by causing purges and diarrhea, by causing a vomit with an emetic, or by sucking out blood with leeches. So it was really all very internally consistent. And because it was so consistent, and because we didn't have scientific method at the time, it lasted well into the 19th century, when the scientific basis of medicine was started largely in Central Europe and in England as well. In addition to these potentially toxic ways of therapy, there were some important beneficial treatments. So wounds and swelling was often treated with warm, moist packs called poultices. There were drugs to treat pain, and wine was used for just about everything as a sedative, as well as an analgesic as well. But it took another 75 years before modern medicine really got going.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the bleeding more. I'm going to bring up an image here, and I want you to tell me if it is true that it's often said that Washington on his deathbed was bled to death by his doctors. So can you elaborate more on that a little bit for me, please?
Right. Well, there are a number of versions of the death of Washington, and this is the dramatic painting Washington on his deathbed by a painter with the glorious name of Junius Brutus Stearns. This was done in 1851. Well, here's the story. George Washington, at about age 67, goes out for a horseback ride on a blustery, cold, snowy December night in Virginia. And he comes back home and shortly begins to get symptoms of fever and severe sore throat. And he develops a severe infection. In modern terms, it would probably be called, what's barely pronounceable, acute necrotizing epiglottitis, severe infection of his throat, epiglottis, and larynx, and he can barely breathe. So his doctors, with the best of intentions and the best of knowledge at the time, treat him with bleeding. And over the course of 12 hours, his contingent of doctors do 4 bleedings, totaling about 2.5 quarts. It's almost 40% of his total blood volume. Well, it clearly didn't do Washington any good. But from my reading of detailed accounts of the death of Washington, I think what really did our glorious George Washington in was this severe throat infection. Almost certainly would have been caused by what we recognize today as streptococcus. And if we had penicillin back then, he would have gotten better in a jiffy. So he did get bleedings, but I don't think that was his actual cause of death.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, going off of what you just said with the whole penicillin thing, we know, so you just said that we know that penicillin would have likely cured him. With some of these counterintuitive medical practices that you were describing earlier, did 18th century doctors have an effective series of medications, and what was the supply like between the two armies in the war?
Well, they did have medications for pain, like laudanum. They did have medications, the Jesuits' bark and the Peruvian bark that they used for malaria and for fevers as well. But on the American side, medications were always in short supply. There just wasn't enough supply in the colonies to support the great numbers of disease caused in the military. What made it worse was that most of the apothecaries were loyalists, and even the patriot apothecaries were pretty reluctant to take the pretty worthless Continental currency. So the American military war chest had to be filled by scrounging, privateers intercepting ships of the British, and eventually a war chest, a military medical chest, France. The British had better supplies, but everything in their logistic force was centralized. So all of their war chest had to come on the 6-week or so voyage from England. So always short supply in the American military.
Gotcha. So there was something that could have helped all of these counterintuitive, practices going against these diseases.
Right.
Now that we've discussed disease, let's get into the gory stuff a little bit and turn to the battlefield and the casualties on the battlefield themselves. What would military surgeons do for a battlefield wound? I know one of the most common operations was that of amputation, which, from my understanding, was really gruesome. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, the operations that a surgeon could do were pretty limited. There were amputations, there was treatment of gunshot wounds, there were treatment of stabbing wounds from bayonets or swords, and for head trauma, they would do an operation called tree panning or tree finding. We'll show that clip coming up. So what would reasons be to do an amputation? Well, in fact, there were many. So any wound that involved a joint, a shattered bone, or repeated abscess or gangrene, that was treated by amputation. And the amputation would be carried out as follows. Do we have the instruments coming up? Yeah. So let's take a look at that top image. And over there in the lower right-hand corner, Andrew, let's point out, so that was a strap-like structure called a tourniquet, and that would be applied. There was no anesthetic. There was no understanding of antisepsis or hygiene. So the tourniquet would be applied, maybe some laudanum for pain would be given. The soldier would be held down and then point to that curved knife in the left-hand side. So with that curved knife, an incision would be made around the limb, cutting down through the skin and through the muscle down to the bone. And then the surgeon's assistant would retract those tissues and then take a look at that hacksaw up at the top. This looks like something you could get at any Ace hardware store today. And with some swift cuts, the surgeon would cut through the bone. Well, a ligature, a suture, a tie would be placed around the major bleeding vessels, and then a stump would be formed and the skin would be sutured over and dressed. And all of this could take place within just maybe 3 minutes. But because there was no understanding about antisepsis, about hygiene, almost every wound became infected, and the mortality rate was somewhere between 20 and 50%, depending on the circumstances. Now, one of the other instruments that we want to point out is the bullet forceps right next to the incision. So when there was a bullet wound and the bullet still lodged in a limb, the objective was to find the bullet with one of the probes over there and then to retrieve it with the bullet forceps. But the ball would often have maddening courses through the limb, ricocheting off bone and twisting around, and it could be a very tedious process to actually retrieve the ball, and these became infected as well. There might be stab wounds, and if this was of a limb and did not involve a major vessel, then the outcome could be okay, but any stab wounds of the chest or of the abdomen, those are almost always fatal because of injury to vital organs or because of ensuing infection. Now let's take a look up at the top, and there's that drill-like structure. So this is called a tree pan or a tree find, and this was used for head wounds or head trauma. And we'll take a look at the clip in a second, but here the idea was to remove a circular disc of the skull bone to relieve pressure on the brain when there was bleeding or swelling or trauma. So let's take a look at this clip and we'll see the surgeon from master and commander removing the treatment. So let's take a look at the faces of the crew. And here is the trepan crunching into the skull bone and removing it. Removing that circular disc. There's the surgeon. Hold fast, give courage. And here is the sailor who's had some head trauma, and his neurosurgical operation is being removed.
Wow.
His
Again,
neurosurgical site is being dressed.
pretty brutal, I would have to say.
Pretty brutal. No anesthetic, no antisepsis. It was pretty brutal.
Pretty brutal. So now that we have an understanding of diseases, practices, and things of that nature, can you please talk about the logistics and the structure of the two armies in terms of medical care? The British had been fighting for almost, had been nonstop wars for decades. How was their medical care organized, and were things different in George Washington's Continental Army?
Right. So the British did have a clear structure of organization. At the upper level, there were the general hospitals staffed by accomplished physicians. And these were for the referral cases or the overflow cases in the case of a battle. So the staff physicians and surgeons would be assisted by assistants. They were called surgical mates. There'd be apothecaries, there'd be cooks, and there would be some nurses as well. And these were often set up in a town. They could be set up in a church or in a large mansion. And in the field, they would be set up in a tent. At the regimental level, each regiment had its own surgeon who was accompanied by a surgical mate or two, and they might have a cook, but they wouldn't have an apothecary. They would have a few medical chests available to be spread around. And the regimental hospital in a town could be set up in a home, and in the field also in a tent. So there was a clear structure. The regimental surgeons were not really very well regulated, and many of them did not have really very strong credentials. In the Continental Army, the structure was based upon the British and generally followed pretty much the British system.
Gotcha. And for Washington's Continental Army?
In the Washington's Continental Army, they followed the British system with the general hospitals as the upper tier, and then the regimental medical establishment as the lower level. Gotcha.
Now, we discussed Benjamin Rush before. Who were some other doctors that led the Continental Army Medical Department? I've heard of, say, Benjamin Church. Did he really become the traitor that everybody made him out to be?
Well, let's bring up the image of
Sure.
Benjamin Church. So the Continental Army Medical Department got off to a really bad start. So here is Benjamin Church, a prominent physician from New England. And during the siege of Boston, around Bunker Hill and the siege of Boston that followed, Benjamin Church was the chief physician. But Benjamin Church had a pretty high lifestyle. His wife was English, and in order to support his lifestyle, he began to collude with the British commanding officer, wrote letters in exchange for gold. He was uncovered, he was arrested, tried for treason, and then jailed in the fall of 1775. For some reason, in 1777, he was allowed to go on a schooner headed for the Caribbean. The ship was lost at sea, and old Benjamin Church was never heard from again. So good riddance to an out-and-out traitor. Well, after Benjamin Church was the chief physician, he was followed by Dr. John Morgan of Philadelphia. He was a skilled, organized, competent physician, but things were pretty rough going. And he got into squabbles with Congress over supplies and funding, and Congress actually ousted him. Following John Morgan, there was another Philadelphia physician by the name of William Shippen, and William Shippen was also an outstanding physician, but he got involved in squabbles with Benjamin Rush, and things never worked very smoothly in the American medical department. But Benjamin Rush was the outstanding highlight, and he did have control of the middle department.
So we can't forget about the women. What about the women in the war? Were there any women doctors? What were the roles of women in terms of medicine?
Right. So there were no women physicians, but women played an indispensable role. Women were called camp followers, and they were loosely organized with both armies. They might be widows of soldiers who died. They might be the wives of soldiers. They might be women seeking freedom after being enslaved. And they moved with the army. They played indispensable roles. And in the hospitals, they often carried out roles of cooking and nursing care, as well as more general roles in the army, as well as sewing and cleaning. So this was an era where women's lib had not yet become part of the social fabric, but women played indispensable roles actually in both armies.
Okay. And so going off of that, the hospitals, let's talk a little bit more about the hospitals. Did the Continental Army Medical Department have general hospitals for, say, the disabled or recuperating soldiers? There was one close by, I believe, at Yellow Springs.
Right. So we can bring that up whenever you can. So in addition to the general hospitals moving with the Army, the American Medical Department had a number of large general hospitals for convalescents. By 1777, there were 10 of them. There was one in Princeton. A bunch were in Pennsylvania. There was one in Reading, Allentown, and Bethlehem. And during the encampment at Valley Forge, there was this one at then called Yellow Springs, subsequently called Chester Springs. I think, Andrew, you were able to ascertain that this photograph was from the early part of the 20th century and the building no longer stands. But as you could see, these were pretty large scale affairs, and they would have up to 200 to 250 soldiers convalescing for periods of months.
Very interesting. Now, we've talked about figures that were solely considered physicians, but there were generals who were physicians in Washington's army as well. Can you elaborate more on some of those prominent figures?
Well, right. I'd love to tell you about three in particular. Let's bring up the image of Dr. Joseph Warren. So Joseph Warren was from a prominent medical family in Boston. And on the left image, this is a portrait of Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the premier physicians in Boston. But he was a patriot at heart. And he became a leader of the patriot cause. In fact, it was Joseph Warren who issued orders to Paul Revere and William Dawes to make their midnight ride before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And then he was in command at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And in the image at the right, this is John Trumbull's painting called The Death of Joseph Warren. So this is after the third British assault on the American redoubt. And there is Joseph Warren mortally wounded. And this is very dramatic and very heroic. where there is a British soldier about to run Warren through with a bayonet. And you see the British officer seeming to hold the bayonet off in respect for Warren. And there is one of Warren's assistants begging for mercy. But Joseph Warren dies at the Battle of Bunker Hill and was one of the early martyrs, one of the early heroes. His name doesn't come down the way Sam and John Adams do, but he was one of the early martyrs, and one of the readings I'll mention is a great tribute to him. Now, the next person that I'd like to mention, the next general, is shown on the next slide, and his name is General Hugh Mercer. Well, Hugh Mercer, pictured there in the upper left, was born in Scotland. He came to the Americas, practiced medicine, settled in Virginia, was a neighbor of George Washington, and he was very active throughout the war in the North. And shown in the upper right panel, this is at the battlefield of Princeton. And at that tree, inside this cordoned off area, this is where General Dr. Hugh Mercer receives his fatal, ultimately fatal wound. Well, he's taken to the bedroom shown in the lower right. This is in the Thomas Clark house, and he lingers and dies a few days later. So this is the second American doctor general I wanted to tell you about. And the third is actually pretty close to home at Brandywine. This is the story of Colonel John Haslett. John Haslett was a native of Ireland. He came and settled in Delaware and practiced there. And he was at the Battle of Princeton. He was actually at Mercer's side when Mercer gets his fatal wound. So the upper panel is a memorial in current day Princeton, and off to the left is the tablet, the placard, which is a tribute to John Haslett, because shortly after Mercer is wounded, Colonel John Haslett takes a British bullet and he dies too. So here we have three American commanding officers, physicians by training, but physician warriors indeed, who all pay the ultimate price.
Wow. Well, Dr. Gibbs, this has all been so fascinating, and we're going to take this whole talk and do a culmination here and talk about your book here. Your book, Long Shot, The Secret History of 1776, contains a lot of medical history. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work?
Right. Well, thanks, Andrew. I published the book last year after a lifetime of medical reading and historical reading. And it's an alternative history asking what if? What if General George Washington was actually shot during the early precarious days of the American Revolution by a British sniper? Well, George Washington loved the thrill of battle. He was often leading from the front, and although true history indicates he was never shot, it could have happened. And my book says that it did, and unleashes a cascade of medical, political, and military events. Well, we know that George Washington didn't die during the American Revolution, but led us to independence and became a glorious first president. So now, having wounded George Washington, I have to save him. And the way that I save him is by creating a fictitious surgeon by the name of Dr. Alexander Grant of Philadelphia, who is imbued with skills far beyond those of the average physician. And he saves Washington's life and the cause of independence. So the book is loaded with medical history as well as military and political history. And it includes descriptions of the hospitals, descriptions of amputations. You will meet Dr. Benjamin Rush in there. You will meet Dr. Benjamin Church in there. I do play with history a bit. There's a leading woman character, a former enslaved woman by the name of Jessie Jones, and she plays an important role. So readers have given it very nice reviews, almost all 5-star reviews, and it is available on Amazon, and I hope that it might tickle your fancy a bit.
Well, yes, I have read most of it, and it is a fine piece of work. So I do commend you on that, and congratulations on all the great reviews and success with that. So to take it one step further, is there any suggested readings that you would like to offer? So if people want to learn more about medicine in the American Revolution, they can go and read about it.
Well, I think there are 3 relatively recent books, all within the last 3 years, and I think you're going to bring them up. So Gene Abrams, who is a faculty member I know at the University of Denver, wrote in 2013 a book called Revolutionary Medicine, The Founding Fathers and Mothers in Sickness and in Health. And then Christian Despina, well known to many members of the BBPA board, just 2.5 years ago, wrote a marvelous biography of Dr. Joseph Warren and entitled him The American Revolution's Lost Hero. And then I've already referred to Stephen Fried's really comprehensive book called Rush, Revolution, Madness, and the Visionary Doctor Who Became a Founding Father. And all 3 of these recent books giving wonderful insight into the whole political and medical as well as military area. And I hope maybe you'll turn to reading The Long Shot during the time that you have available.
Great. Thank you. So we will now open up the floor to any questions that you may have out there. We will start at the top here. After the revolution, do we know approximately what percent, how many of the surviving soldiers were amputees? Do we have historical records of what life was like for them following the war, especially since it seems most of them were farmers? It seems hard to do that labor when limbs are missing. Great presentation, and thank you.
Records haven't come down to us very well, so I don't have that exact number as to the numbers of amputations. We do know that the total deaths killed in action on the American side was about 7,000, and probably 3 times that number were wounded. But I just don't have any specific information about what happened to the amputees.
Our next question, when did sterilization of instruments between operations begin? How much did that contribute to infections?
Right. So Joseph Lister from the United Kingdom was the one who introduced the idea of antisepsis. And there was a wonderful book that came out about 2 years ago about Lister. I think it was called The Butchering Art. And he really had to do quite a yeoman's work to convince the doctors at the time that they needed to use an antiseptic. And he used carbolic acid, and they used it on the surgical field and for instruments as well. And that made a big change. But that was about the 1850s. So the American Revolution, from the viewpoint of safe surgery, was about 75 years too early.
Our next comment is about the John Adams clip. This person says that it was all in all probably Dr. Joseph Warren himself. He was the family physician of the Adams family. And do you think that could have been him?
It could have been Joseph Warren. Joseph Warren had a brother who was also a very prominent physician. So I do have the disc. I will go back and watch it and see if I can figure that out, and maybe we can post that.
Very good.
Good guess.
Can you speak anything? Can you speak to the flying hospitals and how prominent were they versus established hospitals in Bethlehem, Trenton, etc.?
Yeah, so the general hospitals could move with the Army, and when the Army went into the field, they served as flying hospitals as well. They were generally well staffed and supported. And if in the field, they would go up in a tent, but in the Army was in camp, they would be at a mansion, a church, a building of some substance.
Are there any comments you can make regarding burial grounds and burial practices related to the Continental Army hospitals?
Well, I think they understood that death could be spread from a corpse, particularly those of disease, and they would bury them deeply. But I don't know more about the details. Good question.
I do know that I will add to that. That will be a topic down the road that we will have another program about. So if you're interested in that, stick around and keep an eye out for that one. Benjamin Rush also treated Mercer at Princeton, did he not?
Rush was at Princeton, and I think that he did. I have to check that myself also. Good point.
Any idea where Lafayette convalesced after being wounded in the Battle of Brandywine? I've heard
Yes.
it was in Bethlehem.
Yeah, well, that's right. So Lafayette did sustain a wound of his leg at the Battle of Brandywine and did convalesce at one of the hospitals, and I believe it was at Bethlehem.
How can I obtain an autographed copy of the long shot?
If anyone would like to have an autographed copy, send me an email, Ronald S. Gibbs at gmail.com. If we can post that, Ronald S. Gibbs at gmail.com. I do have some copies, and I could send an autographed copy, and I'll give you directions if you send me an email.
And one last one. Microbe theory still unknown. How did medical scientists explain the success of inoculations?
I'm sorry, how did they claim success?
How did they explain the success of inoculations?
Well, I think they, without a good scientific background, they did have good powers of observation. And they also had information from Asia. And so there was a fair amount of travel between particularly Western Europe and Turkey and in Middle East and India. There were well-established practices. So they had this observation as to its effectiveness.
And how were the viruses weakened or inoculation? From the clip, it didn't seem they weakened it. And if not weakened, then why only 1% fatality versus 20%? Was it simply due to the number of people included in the statistical analysis?
Right. So there was nothing done to weaken the virus in the pustular fluid. And it was, the mortality was only 1%. Because of the small dose of the virus that was put into the skin. So just a small amount. So in Western Europe, the inoculum was done through a skin incision, but in India and in the Middle East, they actually blew some dried material into the nose. And that what turned out to be a reasonably safe way to do it also. So I think it was a weakened case because of the low dose, not because anything was done to kill the virus. That would have been a great idea for someone to have tried in the 1770s.
Dr. Leonard Rothman says, congratulations on a great lecture, Dr. Gibbs. So there you go.
Thank you, Lynn.
And our last question is, were Army and Navy physicians formerly part of the military service with an officer's rank?
No, they really didn't have officer's rank. They were considered like clergymen. They had titles of doctor or surgeon or mister, but they didn't really fit into the line medical establishment.
And I'm sorry, I missed one here. What do you know of Dr. James Lloyd from Boston?
James
Lloyd. That was the question.
He's missed my periscope. Does someone want to add something about him?
Somebody, whoever asked the question. All right. Any other questions for Dr. Gibbs? All right. Well, somebody was kind enough to post his email in the chat. So if you would like a copy, an autographed copy of the long shot, please send Dr. Gibbs an email. Dr. Gibbs, I want to thank you very much for a very fascinating interview talk this evening. It's always it's just a great topic that captivates the mind. So you know, comparing just how in the last 200 some odd years we've made such a leap in modern medicine and technology, it's mind-boggling. So I want to thank you. Congratulations on your success with the book. And I want to thank everybody for attending this evening. Again, this will be available on our YouTube channel for anyone Battlefield Park Associates in the upcoming days. We will also be posting more information about our program next month. So look for that on all of our social media and websites as well. So thank you all again, and we hope you have a very safe evening. And again, thank you, Dr. Gibbs.
Andrew, thank you for organizing and for getting the graphics all lined up. And everyone, be thankful for the advances of modern medicine.
Absolutely. We'll end it on that one. Thank you all and have a great night. Take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.